Hello, hello, everybody. This is your host, Ashley, and we have an off week this week, but never fear. I did record with Noah Daniels from the Real Hauntings Podcast, and he so kindly sent me over our episode so I can share with you here on my podcast. Thank you, Noah. I really enjoyed being a guest on your podcast, and I can't wait to talk to you again soon. Make sure you run over and you check out the Real Hauntings Podcast, available wherever you get your podcast. So until next week, they'll see you later.
You're listening to the Real Hauntings Podcast, featuring your host, Noah Daniels.
What's up, everyone? It's Noah Daniels, and yes, we're here for another episode of the Real Hauntings Podcast, the podcast where we try to get to the bottom of what's going on in these ghost stories. On this episode, I'm very excited. We have Ashley from the Ghost Gossip Podcast. I love following her and her husband's TikTok and listening to their stories, and their podcast as a standalone is awesome too. Ashley, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be back. It's been a while.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on. So I know, we were talking a little bit back and forth before you came on, and you said that you've been having experiences since you were fairly young. Is that what got you interested in starting a podcast?
I started having encounters when I was 13 years old, and I just kind of wrote it off because I didn't know what it was. Being young, you don't know what it is. And it wasn't until I bought a haunted house and lived in it and didn't know it was haunted until I was in it that I really started getting interested. I've always been kind of weird and didn't shy away from it. But once I lived in it and, I couldn't escape it, I was like, I love this.
And on your podcast, I know you have a lot of listener stories and you have people on as well. What has kind of been the most interesting or most spooky thing that you've revealed on the podcast?
Well, I think the spookiest thing that happened to me, other than the house, if you take away the house, because the house was just so much, it was a lot of little things. But I think the spookiest thing that happened, we went to the Crescent Hotel in February of this year. And my husband, who is a non-believer, we had gone to bed. We hadn't done the ghost tour yet. And we were laying in bed together, sleeping. Not really laying. We were passed out. It was travel day. We were exhausted. And at 3:30 on the dot, we heard scratching go across the ceiling from one end to the other. And both of us sat up and all I said was, it's scratching, that's scratching, that's scratching. And then we went back to sleep like it was nothing.
Now, as somebody who doesn't believe in the paranormal, did that event change his mind at all or open his mind at all?
Living where we lived for 2.5 years changed his mind a lot, but that freaked him out a little bit. That kind of opened his eyes, but it was living in the haunted house that really got him. But he'll still argue with me. Like, stuff happens in our new house and he's like, I'll just explain that away. And I'm like, have you not learned anything?
Well, let's jump back to when you were 13. Can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah. So when I was 13, my very first experience, now I have two that were very close together, so I cannot remember which one was first, but I was with my family and they were taking me to babysit their friend's kid. And I was really excited. This was like my first babysitting gig. And I ran up to the door. My parents were behind me and I rang the doorbell and this dog started barking at the door. And it was a little dog. So of course, me being 13, I was like, oh yes, they have a dog. They opened the door and there was no dog. And so I didn't think anything about it. But then that night I was laying there and they came back from dinner and I was like, oh, by the way, where's your dog? And they were like, our dog died 6 months ago.
Oh, wow.
And so that was really cool because I experienced it with my mom and my dad and it wasn't just me. And then the other one I had, it was right after my grandfather died. I had a really complicated relationship with him and I didn't know how to feel after he died. It was like the first big death in the family that I experienced. And I was laying awake at like 1 a.m, just kind of processing. And he smelled like an old man, like that brute, and all of a sudden my whole room smelled of that scent. So those were like my first two. They were really close together. So that was like my first big opening into that. There's something else.
With the dog, have you had any other instances with animals that have passed away since then, or is that the only one?
No, I've had some. I had a cat. She was 20 years old when she passed away. And I would see little footprints after she died, like almost like in her kitty litter, but I didn't have kitty litter anymore because she had passed away. And so I would see her little footprints on the bathroom floor. or I would hear her. Or my lab, who passed away after 14 years, I would hear his tippy taps on the hardwood.
Spirits of animals is such an interesting thing that does happen to people who have loved, obviously their pets or what have you. Did you feel like having that happen to you brought you extra closure to your pet's passing, or how did that make you feel?
It definitely made me feel better, like they were okay, especially my lab, because he was having a lot of issues getting around, and my cat, she had cancer. Seeing or hearing the tippy taps of my dog, and it was like he wasn't limping, and it was just like those, like, that little it was like, okay, he's okay, like he's able to move around, he's not in pain anymore. And it was some comfort. And then, it's probably not paranormal, but I dream about him sometimes, and it's like a lucid dream, and he's running, and it's just very comforting knowing that he's not limping and he's not aching. And it is comforting to know that if they are still there, which I believe they are, they're okay, and they're still with you, and they're still watching you.
And when you could smell the aroma of your grandfather, did you call out to him in that moment when you were in your room? Or as a younger person, how did you process that event?
I went to my mom, and my mom is also very spiritual. And I was like, I was kind of scared to tell her, because it was like, I smelled grandpa last night. She was very supportive. She was like, he's just saying goodbye. Because I didn't get to say goodbye to him. He died in the hospital.
Okay.
He had been sick, but we lived in South Carolina. He lived in Georgia. We didn't make it in time. And I had seen him by the time we got there, he had passed away. And so I'd seen him through a window. And it was a lot seeing him passed away, and he was bloated from being hooked up to the machines.
Yeah.
And so it was almost like that was him saying goodbye. And that's how she explained it to me. Like, he was telling you goodbye, and like it was okay. And because we were not close, and I didn't know how to process it, because I wasn't like super sad. I know that sounds terrible, but we weren't close. And she was devastated. So it was like, should I be devastated too?
Mm-hmm.
So it was hard, and I was feeling bad for not feeling bad. And so that way it was a way of comfort, I guess. And that's how she explained it. He was saying goodbye. It's okay.
It is really unnerving when you're a child and you see somebody in that situation. Like, I had somebody I was really close to, and we went to say our goodbyes, and they had a lot of kidney issues over the years. They're on dialysis, and their body was super bloated like that. And it was almost like seeing someone else there.
Yes.
He
He was on dialysis as well. So it was the same thing. Yeah.
I mean, it was a while ago, but it didn't even feel like that person's energy was in the room.
No.
It was such a odd experience. Now, when you were younger, did you have any scary experiences with the paranormal?
I had a scary one when I was about 21 years old. I had gone to a friend's house, and I think it was around Halloween, and it was right before I got married. I was married very young. I mean, 21, you think you're an adult and grown, but I look back and I'm like, I was a baby.
Yeah.
But I had gone to my friend's house. It was her parents' house to not trick or treat, hand out candy while people trick or treat. And she told me the story of her neighbor that had committed suicide. And she was telling me how he was a troubled youth and would almost stage these events in order, like almost attention seeking. And the last time his parents didn't make it home on time, and that since his passing, they had been having weird things around the house. Well, as she's talking about it, I just get this horrible, like weird feeling, like goosebumps all over my body. And just, I'm like, I don't feel right. So I go home, and I just feel like I'm not alone. And I get home, and I had a Jack Russell. I go into my room, and I remember I was facing where my bed was. I was facing the bathroom, and in the bathroom was a window, and you could see the back porch light. My dog was standing on the corner of the bed, looking that way, growling, hair on end, really upset. And he was not aggressive, and he was showing his teeth. I was laying there looking, and the light, the porch light, like came. So I was like, that's weird. Got up and I turned it off. I came back and it was on. And I was like, went back, turned it off. I came back and it was on. And I just was like, I'm closing the bathroom door. That night I didn't sleep. I just felt really uneasy. And when I got back from work the next day, my silverware had been taken out of the drawer and was like on the floor. And it was like, and so I called my friend who was a Wiccan, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. And I don't know if I'm imagining this or maybe I'm doing this to myself. I don't know, but I feel like somebody's with me. So she said, you need to call your friend and get her to come and get him. And I was like, what? So I did. She said, tell him he's not welcome. Tell him he's got to go. So I called my friend and I was like, you're going to think I'm crazy, but you need to come over here. And so she got there and she's like, now what? And I was like, you must leave. You are not welcome here. And I was like, okay. And she's like, that's it. I was like, I guess, I don't know. And so she got in the car and she left. And it wasn't until I shared a TikTok about him that I ever felt him again. And I was like, oh no, we're not doing this again. So it's been 20 years.
Did you call your friend 20 years later and be like, hey, weird request?
No, I saw what is so funny is so funny. I saw her. I shared that TikTok. I did like 13 days to Halloween, and I was sharing like an encounter every single day.
Oh, wow.
I was going to celebrate my 40th birthday, and she's a TSA agent. And I saw her like 14 days after I shared that episode. And I was like, I haven't seen her since I was 21.
Wow. That is wild.
Yes.
Are you in South Carolina now or
Yeah.
what state? Oh, okay, cool.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm in the upstate.
Nice. Well, let's talk about your haunted house that you lived in. What clued you in that you were living in a haunted house?
The lights. It was the lights. It was the lights and, well, you know, with that Michael guy or whatever. And it was the lights. I would leave a room and I knew I would turn a light off. Like I know. And then I was feeling like I was being watched all the time. And I just had that uneasy feeling constantly. But it was when the lights started coming on, because at first I was just like, we're in a new house. You know, I'm just getting used to the energy. I'm in a new house. But then when the lights started coming on, and then I had one of my daughters was like, she looked like hell. Like, can I say hell?
You can say whatever you want.
Okay.
You can curse away.
Okay. She looked like absolute crap. And I'm like, she hadn't slept in a week. And I'm like, what is going on with this 10-year-old? And she's like, I feel like somebody's watching me all the time. And I saw him in the loft and I've been having nightmares and I saw him in my room and then he was reaching for me. And I was like,
Ugh.
oh no, like, okay, so it's not just me. It's not just me who's feeling this. So, yeah, that's how it started. And I tried to sage the house. I totally screwed it up. Had a friend come over and we saged it again. I had a whole thing that happened when we were saging. And then it got better. And then it got real bad and it got dark. And it's like the more I fought it, the worse it got. And finally, like, I was just like, I cussed him out one day and I was like, you know, we can live in harmony, but you got to stop screwing with my kids.
Mm-hmm.
And we did. We lived there and we moved recently, but I still have the house. I went and talked to him tonight, went and visited him, and sounds like a crazy person, I swear. But it's like we almost became family, which is really weird to say out loud. I promise I'm not crazy.
Your husband, how was he during those experiences as somebody who traditionally has not believed in the supernatural?
Oh, it's electrical. Somebody must have a remote and they're screwing with us. It must be a wire crossed. It was just a vibration. It wasn't until he started hearing the footsteps, like we would hear phantom footsteps when the kids weren't home because we are a blended family of 5. And so every other weekend we are childless. Mm-hmm. And it would be upstairs and we would hear the footsteps. And when the animals started hearing the footsteps and he was like, I would be asleep. And then we started seeing orbs on the camera. They would trigger the cameras to come on. And it was just all these things. And I'm like, how are you going to explain this? And he's like, I can't. It's just too many things. I can't. And then when I saw a shadow move and I was editing a podcast episode in my studio in the basement, I see this giant shadow move and it's bigger than him. And I asked him, like, how can you explain this? And he's like, I can't. I can't. And so he just kind of like succumbed. But it was.
Okay, I'll admit this one house is haunted and we just happen to live in it.
Just one.
We found it.
We found it. When we started having stuff happen here in our new house, I mean, he started the same old thing. It must be electrical. I'm like, everyone It's just electrical everywhere we go. Everybody has shit electric. Like wires are just bad everywhere, according to him.
What were y'all experiencing in your current home?
Oh my gosh. So we have an automatic trash can, and this thing never opens on its own. Like sometimes it doesn't even open when you're waving your hand over it. And you're
Yeah.
like, hello, I got to act like a new hand. Open, 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 open. We were all sitting there. We were watching a Halloween movie, and this trash can went floop, and all of us jumped, and all the animals were in the living room with us, and all of us are sitting on the couch, and we look at each other, and he goes, oh, it just does that. And I'm like, okay. And then the computer that was behind him had been asleep the whole time. We were all watching a movie, and then all of a sudden my computer wakes up. And then I was home alone, and the Alexas sometimes go off on their own, and it's like they hear something and they're like, okay. And then it just starts doing something when you're home alone. And I was sitting in the living room, and I'm the only one with access to the Alexas, like through a telephone or a computer. And my son's music in his room started playing like really loud.
That's really
and I will,
creepy.
yes. And I will hear things in the attic, and I'm like, okay, maybe that's just the wind. But it is definitely, there's definitely some weird vibes every once in a while, but I wouldn't say it's haunted, but I would say like every once in a while, it just feels like the energy shifts a little bit.
I had an experience that I had never had before, really just a couple of nights ago. I gone to bed before my wife, and I was really tired, and I woke up, and in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, she's in the room. She's going to get in bed and go to sleep. I didn't open my eyes, and I felt her sit at the end of the bed, which would be weird. And I'm thinking like, oh, that's a little strange. And then I thought I felt her lay back to her pillow, and I rolled over to open my eyes to say something, and there was nobody there. I was the only person in the room.
I've had that happen.
Oh,
It is creepy.
yeah. And I've heard people on the podcast that I've interviewed describe things, in that genre of hauntings. And part of me always wondered, like, how could they tell, or like, what is that sensation like, I guess?
Yeah.
And it's pretty clear. I mean, you feel a presence, you feel a weight in the bed, and to open your eyes and be completely alone, but not be alone. You know what I mean?
You're not. Like,
Yeah.
you're not alone. I had that happen after one of my best friends died when I was a teenager. She was in a car wreck, real tragic. And we were supposed to be together, and she went another way. And so being 18 years old, it was like, it's my fault. It's my fault, because if she would have been with me, she wouldn't have been in that car. Her and her boyfriend both were tragically killed. And it was homecoming senior year, and I could not sleep. And I had finally like drifted off to sleep about a week after she was buried. And I felt my bed dip down, like somebody sat on it. And I opened my eyes, and she's sitting there, and she's like, I just don't want you to be mad at me. And I was like, I'm not mad at you. And she was gone. And so I've had that happen, but I talked to somebody. I don't know if I was dreaming, but it is a very distinct feeling when your bed dips down and it startles you awake, because you're not alone anymore.
Your ability to interact with the paranormal, is that something you feel like has been passed down through your family? Or I know you mentioned your mom was fairly spiritual, but as far as having these direct interactions, do you know of anyone else in your family who also experiences that?
My sister, but she will not acknowledge them. She's
Really?
like, don't acknowledge it. Don't acknowledge it. You don't know who you're talking to. And I'm like, oh. So she's very curious, but she doesn't want to interact. And where I am, I'm like, hello, hello, come and talk to me. I'm going to start a podcast and talk to you
exactly.
all the time.
What does she think about you having a paranormal podcast?
She thinks it's interesting, and she has so many cool stories, and so does her husband, but they won't talk about it. And I'm like, come on. But she, I think, and I know this, again, I swear I'm not crazy. I swear she astral projects, because her husband and her son have seen her while she's asleep in different places in the house, and she's in bed sleeping. But she'll say, her her son will actually say that's the other mother, which I think
Ew.
is terrifying. Okay. I'm like, oh, you think I'm the freak?
Yeah. You think I'm the freak. That might be the title of this episode. Um,
I approve. I like it.
so I want to jump to your podcast. I think that you have one of the cooler names for a paranormal podcast. How did you come up with Ghost Gossip?
I was actually listening to another podcast and they were just like, they're like, we're just gossiping. We're just gossiping. It's a paranormal. And I was thinking,
Mm,
ghost gossip. And I wrote it down and I was like, I got to remember that because wanted to get into podcasting, but I'm like, nobody's going to listen to me talk about anything. And so one day I woke up and I was like, I'm going to start a podcast about paranormal. I'm going to call it Ghost Gossip and I'm going to gossip about ghosts. And that's what I did.
I got nervous the first time I came across your podcast on TikTok. I was like, oh no, is this somebody talking shit about all the podcast hosts? And
No.
I was like, oh, phew, it's just Ghost.
Just ghost. It doesn't matter what it is. If it falls under that little paranormal, I'm just going to talk about it. That's kind of how I feel. Like it's like an umbrella and I don't care what it's about as long as it's like paranormal. Like even my husband, he loves conspiracies and I do. We finally did an episode about his little conspiracies that he believes in and talked all about them. And some of them were paranormal. So I felt like it fell, we're just talking. So
Make it work,
yeah, exactly. It's my podcast.
Yeah. What are your favorite types of paranormal stories to cover on your podcast?
Oh, I love haunted houses. And I think it's because of just my ability to relate to the other people who have experienced it. But I love hearing about like haunted hotels or people that see full body apparitions or if they encounter them, they talk to them, or if they like dreaming. I think dreams are fascinating. I haven't had a dream episode, but people that have really vivid dreams or oh gosh, I had one, it was like a guardian angel. She sent me this story and it was like multiple times in her life that she encountered this woman. And it was just fascinating. I need to reshare that episode because that was when I first started. And I loved that one because it was a little spooky, but it was comforting.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was beautiful. I really like them all, but I think the haunted houses are my favorite just because I can relate to them. It's like, okay, I'm not alone.
And do people in your personal life know that you have the podcast?
Oh, yeah. 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 All of them know. Some of them think it's weird. My uber religious friends, like they are like curious, but they won't really talk about it with me.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not judgmental. I mean, they might be, but not openly. But most of my friends, like they've been at my house and something's weird happened before. Okay. So they're just like, oh, okay, that's Ashley's house. That's weird.
And what about your kids? I know you had mentioned your daughter had that experience when she was 10. What do they think about the podcast? And like, has your daughter continued to have experiences or was that kind of it?
Yeah, none of them have since we've moved. I'm the only one. But if I think that they're at this age, they're all teenagers. So I think they're at this age where if they do experience something, they might explain it away at this point because they're unsure. But they think the podcast is really cool. We all experienced something in the house. And there was one night I was in my office and the light just was going on and off and on and off and on and off. And we were all in there and they thought that was the coolest thing. And they were a little freaked out, but they loved the fact that they got to experience it as a family because they're like, okay, we're not crazy either. Like they would hear things in the house and that must just be the house. But they would hear the footsteps. They would hear things on their ceiling. My one daughter would see things. And so at first it was scary, but now they're just like, they think it's really cool. And they tell everybody, we lived in a haunted house. We lived in a haunted house. My mom has a podcast. We live in a haunted house.
Well, that's great if they can embrace it and take away that general fear that I think young people share with the paranormal. At least when I was a kid, we all did. I feel like these younger generations get braver and braver every generation because they kind of have to with how the world is these days. So,
Right. Well, especially like YouTube, all the ghost hunting shows. Like my son wants to be a ghost hunter now.
Oh, really?
Yes, he wants all the things. And I have some tools that I use when I go, or I was there today and had my REM pod and had a spirit talker and was using that. And he thinks this is just the coolest thing. But like, he's like, I'm going to be famous. I'm going to go and hunt paranormal locations. And I'm like, you do you, boo. You got this. So he wants to pursue it.
But the difference with how kids, Gen Alpha, Gen Z, I mean, this is just kind of a tangent. I'll probably cut it out, but they have been raised to be content creators. It's really fascinating. So my kid, he's 4 now, and his favorite thing to watch is like there's like 2 or 3 other kids. There's this kid, Evan Storm, and he loves to watch their YouTube channels of just them like playing with toys and they're super annoying dads like doing the YouTube voice of like, come on, what, and drives me because it's so unauthentic. I struggle when things aren't authentic, and it just drives me. But I'm like, can't we watch Paw Patrol, something story driven?
Right. Why do you want to watch somebody playing instead of you going and playing? Yes.
But but it makes so much sense, that they're able, these younger generations are able to conquer TikTok and figure out the algorithms and do all that stuff is because that's what they've been raised to do. I mean, I grew up watching MTV and everything was, polished and, until like Real World came around, things like that. But, but in general, in general, it was, kind of traditional on edge TV stuff. And it's just, it's so different,
It was like really TGIF. Different. Like, my husband and I were just talking about it. It was like that Friday night and you had your lineup and that's what you watched. You watched your lineup. And then the next week, the storyline continued.
Yeah. That's Steve Urkel, all the greats.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Ashley, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and sharing these stories. If somebody's listening and they really like your vibe, what would you tell them to expect if they come and check out your podcast? And what is the best way for them to check out your content and your podcast?
Well, my podcast is Ghost Gossip, and I should be on all platforms. You can find me at Ghost Gossip Podcast on Instagram, Ghost Gossip Pod on TikTok, and Ghost Gossip 24/7 at gmail.com to email all of your own ghost gossip because I love sharing other people's stories. What they can expect from my podcast is I share my own stories. There's a lot of those on there. But also what I've started doing is going to locations that are near me. I mean, not really near me. I went to Arkansas and trying to just experience these haunted places. And I go with no intention of having anything happen, but just to learn the history and just feel it for myself. And then I share those. And I also have started researching haunted locations and started sharing the history and some stories from those locations. So, but yes, you can find me on TikTok, Instagram, and all the platforms.
And big picture, what do you want to accomplish with the podcast?
Big picture? I don't know. I've never been asked that question before. It is something it's like a passion project. I don't make anything. I'm a stay-at-home mom, and I really just do this because it is something that I do for me, that I enjoy doing. And it's just something that I kind of keep myself grounded. Like I don't lose myself to motherhood and being a wife and all this the life that I live. This is mine. I just like doing it.
Absolutely. That's a great answer. Well, let's get you paid. People go listen to Ashley's podcast.
Go listen. I'm trying to get monetized.
Yeah, rate, review, all those good things that you can do. Sorry, I don't know why I made that rhyme, but yeah, definitely go check it out. You'll enjoy the banter between her and her husband, and she shares a lot of interesting stories and some good on location stuff like she was talking about, especially on TikTok. You can get a nice glimpse of, I feel like, kind of the world you're creating around the paranormal. So with that, I'm Noah Daniels.
I'm Ashley.